gentlemen, I give you the Royal Air Force Battle of Britain Memorial Flight.
£9.5.
Quite low, aren't they?
Oh yeah. I think the land base is about 4,000 feet.
Yeah. Look at that. Wow.
Yeah, boy.
You know when the Spitfire 100 and the 480, I'm on the land at the moment.
That could be play movement. Incoming Spitfire Hurricane, straight ahead, so come right round, straight towards us.
Got you, thank you. aircraft is behind. Yes,
Yeah.
so concentrate on these. Coming in then?
No, it's all been out. It's doing circuits. Get it revving up though. Behind trees. Lancaster coming from the right.
Is your opposition pass?
Yeah, opposition pass. So stay where you are. Get the,
You're the stacked above each other.
I think so, yeah. Oh, it's picked up, hasn't it? Stand back for you from here, Chris. Spin again.
We'll do a break now.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I give you the Royal Air Force Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, lest we forget. Here we're talking about .5, the 50 cal, 8 of them on this aircraft. Here she is. fabulous sound as the 2,300 horsepower Pratt & Whitney double wasp radial engine is really wound up in a dive, and showing us here something of one of the attributes that made this such an outstanding aeroplane, namely the fact that because it's so big and so heavy, it was an aeroplane that you could build up a lot of energy in a dive, fly through, particularly on an air-to-ground tasking, and then climb rapidly away. This was, however, also an excellent air-to-air dogfighter, perhaps not as good as the likes of the Spitfire or the Mustang as a close-in dogfighter, because it is a large and quite bulky aeroplane. But everyone I've ever spoken to who's flown a P-47 praises this aircraft's handling characteristics to the hilt, and as a gun platform for example, air-to-ground strafing missions, very steady, very stable. And it was those sort of attributes that meant it had such a great role after the P-51 Mustang came to the fore in the US 8th Air Force. Three main fighter types deployed to Europe with the US Army Air Forces in the Second World War. There was the P-51 Mustang, we'll see in a bit, and the very distinctive twin-engine, twin-boom Lockheed P-38 Lightning. And of all those three, it was the P-47 that played the biggest role in the lead-up to D-Day, softening up the German Luftwaffe at its bases on the ground. This one has got the black and white invasion stripes applied to the wings and fuselage, which were painted on as an identifier in the hours leading up to D-Day to enable the easy distinction between Allied and Axis aeroplanes. This one is in the colours of a P-47 of the 9th Air Force, which was also, like the 8th Air Force, stationed in the UK. The 9th primarily providing close support to ground forces, and it represents a Thunderbolt flown by the 492nd Fighter Squadron of the 9th Air Force in the D-Day period. And this aircraft was capable of taking a tremendous amount of damage and still make it back home. Some amazing pictures from the Second World War of aircraft that did make it home, where there's more holes than airframe. And of course, one of the things that helped that was the double wasp engine, which is air-cooled. We've seen the Spitfire and the Hurricane, Griffin engine, Merlin engine, all liquid-cooled. They have a lot of pipe work. One round damaging that pipework means the coolant leaks, that terrible white thin stream of smoke behind, and the engine will cease. Not so in an aircraft like this. Interesting you should mention that, Andy, because some years ago I met a veteran of the 78th Fighter Group, the Duxford-based US 8th Air Force group that was part of the 8th Fighter Command that switched in late 1944 from the P-47 to the P-51, called Huey Lamb. And he said they were not keen to switch from the P-47 to the P-51 for that very reason. They thought the P-51 would be badly affected by battle damage. Of course, they soon grew to love the Mustang, as he said, but it was in their minds when that conversion happened. was that dreaded little plume of white smoke behind the aircraft, which was the coolant leaking away, and that could come about by one single round. A rifle bullet from the ground fired into the air happens to hit some of the pipework, just like your radiator on the car. But of course with your car you can stop and let it cool down. In this you had about 90 seconds before the engine would freeze solid. And in the sort of low-level roles that these aircraft were playing, especially in the European theatre, but also in the Pacific, that sort of survivability really mattered.
Sound, isn't it? It's pretty quiet.
We mustn't forget, Andy, that the RAF flew Thunderbolts as well, 830 of them with Southeast Asia Command, and you can see one of those in the other RAF museum location at Hendon in North London, depicting that other really important aspect of this great fighter's history.
See, the wind would be blowing all the sound away.
Yeah.
Final pass then. Coming up, the aircraft will be landing back on afterwards though. An aeroplane we've not seen here for a few years. It did come in for static display at our big RAF 100 show in 2018. At that point, this aeroplane had only just rejoined the British Air Show circuit. It was a stalwart for many years in the ownership of the fighter collection at Duxford. It was then sold to the USA, but since 2018 it's been back here with the fleet of fighter aviation engineering. Such a charismatic aeroplane, beautifully flown, and a very, very important aeroplane for us to have as part of the lineup of airworthy warbirds on hand with different UK operators. Such was the role this aircraft had flying out of the UK during the Second World War with US Army Air Forces units and overseas with the Royal Air Force. May look like a big brute, but believe me, those who fly it say it's a real pussycat. Lovely handling, and you can easily see why this was such a successful fighter.
And certainly an aircraft that went better downhill than up.
Yes, you could say that, but once you've got it wound up, as I said, Andy, though, you know, you could climb away very, very effectively.
And of course in the escort role that is so important. We're not talking about Battle of Britain type scrambles here. We are talking about being at altitude, supporting bombers both on their way to and on their way back from a target. And how great that the aircraft's operating from here. So the display's not over. Well, unfortunately we don't get too many landings here at Cosford because of the size of the runway. So this is a really lovely sight.
It is, especially against such a nice verdant backdrop as the one we have here. This aeroplane is, as I said, in the colours of an aircraft of the 492nd Fighter Squadron of the wartime US 9th Air Force, and it's named Nellie B. That squadron was stationed at Ibsley in Hampshire in the New Forest. During the D-Day period, it bombed bridges behind the Normandy beachhead on the 6th of June 1944 itself. It also played a major part in missions to liberate the Netherlands and flew from several bases in newly liberated Europe, advancing as the Allied frontline forces did. And that unit, the 492nd Fighter Squadron, still in existence today at RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk, flying the F-15E Strike Eagle with the modern US Air Force. And this P-47 has been an honoured guest at Lakenheath on several occasions for heritage events staged there, providing that vital connection between the past and the present of American forces here in Britain.
Basically, it's got a decoder engine in it.
Gabriel Barton there, flying the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. And we'll see the P-51 from the same operator, Fighter Aviation Engineering, a little later in the programme.
So, just looking ahead to what we have planned for the next hour or so, the next display is due to be one of the additions to the flying programme. In fact, I can see it just taxiing out onto the runway now, way to your left-hand side. No, in fact, that's the tutor, I think, that's going to take off first. And then he's going to disappear into the hold and come back to display for us after the next item, which will be the bird dog. As I mentioned, a late addition, but very welcome addition to the flying programme.
And there it goes.
No, with the
And indeed, a very short takeoff for this aircraft, which was adapted from the civilian Cessna 170 to meet a US Army need for a new aircraft for the observation, fire control and liaison roles. Importantly, it was to be of all-metal construction to replace the likes of the earlier Piper L4 and Stinson L5, designs that had dated from World War II. First flew in 1949, entered service with the US Army the following year, and the US Army's bird dogs, called L-19s at that point, went straight into action in the Korean War. They were also flown by observation squadrons of the US Marine Corps in Korea, and only one bird dog was actually flown by the RAF, by a single RAF flight operating in Korea, and it was deemed superior to the Oster AOP-6s that were otherwise being flown by the Brits in Korea. But nonetheless, the Oster soldiered on, and we only ever flew that one bird dog. You can see here, it's a very manoeuvrable platform at low level.
And as we watch this display and the manoeuvres, I think we should really just remember the role of this aircraft, because what it's doing now is what it did in its war role, but it did this right over the heads of the enemy. Its main job was to spot the positions of the enemy and then pass that information back to various platforms. That could be 4 F4s about to tip in and drop a lot of bombs. It could be to a ship out at sea to fire a salvo of 16-inch caliber shells. It could be artillery pieces, but its job was to get very low, very close to the enemy, and then pass that information back. That is a very serious military role.
Yeah, the Forward Air Controller Airborne, as we now call it, FAC-A.
So capabilities that we're seeing, very manoeuvrable, good slow speed handling is exactly what it needs for that role, but not so good in terms of surviving the battlefield.
Nonetheless, though, Andy, I mean, you were talking about how the P-47 could withstand a lot of battle damage. That was true of this, what might appear to be light aeroplane. In 1952, flying in Korea, one US Army bird dog had 12 feet of its starboard wing shot off by anti-aircraft artillery, but it was repaired and it flew again the next day.
And the courage of the crew of this aircraft, because by definition they've got to have good view. The side windows are actually canted out, so you can stick your head out and look down. There's transparency on top of the wing, so you can look up. They must have felt very, very vulnerable.
They certainly must have, and when these aircraft went on to fly in the Vietnam War, by which time the US Army had turned most of its bird dogs over to the US Air Force, and they were now known as the O-1, O for observation, 469 bird dogs were lost by all the operators that flew them there. Some did remain in US Army service, but mostly they were turned over to the Air Force. They were also also flown there by the US Marine Corps, by the South Vietnamese, by Air America on behalf of the CIA. Now, I mentioned the colour scheme on this one is that of South Vietnam, and it represents one of the most fascinating bits of the whole bird dog story. It's painted as the aircraft of Major Buang Ly of the South Vietnamese Air Force, who on the morning of the 30th of April 1975 took off from Con Son Island to escape the end of fighting in South Vietnam as the North Vietnamese overran Southern Territory, and of course Saigon was evacuated. He flew his little bird dog out over the South China Sea, hoping to find a US Navy carrier to land on, and he ended up doing so. He landed on USS Midway, and it was the first bird dog ever to touch down on an aircraft carrier. Now, I admit we have a fairly brisk wind today, but that is a very slow speed pass. It is indeed, and hopefully we'll have given you the chance to look at some of the equipment this bird dog is carrying. Under the wings, you might have noticed it's got 8 2.5-inch incendiary rockets, which were known as Willie Pete's. Of course, these are dummies for display purposes. Those were used for part of the role that Andy was describing earlier, marking enemy positions. And on top of the wing, you can see there's a huge 8-foot tall whip antenna, and that was used so that the aircraft could maintain communications with ground stations when it was getting very low down over the battlefield. For example, low literally into the jungle canopy or amongst the weeds. I mean, by bird dog standards, this is quite a high altitude display. It really would be right down there, very low. And target marking, it just makes me think of the Pathfinders during the Second World War, so very similar. Dropping flares, dropping something that illuminates a point. Even if that's not the exact target, it can be used as a marker that then can be relayed. See my flares, left, 400 yards. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the reasons aircraft like this definitely have to be categorised as warbirds, just like the Spitfires, just like the Hurricanes, just like the Mustangs and so forth.
And if you're the enemy and you have one of these above you, it's a prime target, because you know what that aircraft is doing. If it sees you, it will call up some support, be it from the air, be it from the ground, be it from sea. So, yeah, these were prime target aircraft for the enemy.
Yeah, you can see the sort of aircraft that to some extent pioneered that role during the Second World War, represented here in our static display just off to the right of the control tower as part of one of our vintage static display areas by Simon Tilling's lovely little Oster Mark I, one of the very first air observation post aircraft operated by the RAF on behalf of the British Army during the Second World War.
And of course it's a role that endured, because after the bird dog we moved into sort of the Skymaster and the Bronco.
We did have helicopters.
And then helicopters as well. More recent aircraft, but still doing the same role, which was really the first ever role of air power, all the way back to the First World War.
Yes.
Seeing over the enemy's trenches, over their line. What are they doing? Are my shells hitting the enemy, or are they not?
Yeah, it was the, as you say, it was one of the bedrocks of air power from the beginning, but this use of high-winged light aeroplanes really dates from the run-up to World War II, and a British artillery officer called Jack Parham, who had a little Aeronca C2 of his own, and he realised the potential of flying an aircraft like that for the artillery spotting role, and it led on to the likes of the Oster that I just mentioned, for the US Army, particularly the Piper L4 Cub, and as time went on, this aircraft took over that role, and it's great to see it represented here by this one, which dates from 1957. It served with the French Army aviation arm, the Aviation Légère de l'Armée de Terre. It was sold onto the civil market in the 1990s. It's been through a few owners in the UK. It's currently part of the fleet of Kennet Aviation, established by that great enthusiast of vintage aviation, particularly post-war types, of which he's had a good few pass through his hands. Tim Manor, based at Old Warden, the home of the Shuttleworth collection in Bedfordshire, and in fact at the controls today for that very nice display of the L19E bird dog was one of the Shuttleworth collection pilots, former RAF TriStar pilot Scott Butler.
Good afternoon everyone, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the 2025 Royal Air Force Tutor Display. My name is Flying Officer Seb Wilson and I'm the Tutor Display Manager this season. It's a pleasure to display the Grob Tutor for you all today. And now, flying in towards us from the centre at nearly 200 miles an hour is the Tutor Display pilot, Flight Lieutenant Bob Dews. As he pulls up at 5G, he converts his speed into height to perform his first manoeuvre, the Hammerhead. Flight Lieutenant Dews was born in Carmarthen, South Wales, and started his flying career in the Royal Air Force in 1989, flying the Queen of the Skies, the VC-10, out of RAF Bryce Norton, and then as a search and rescue pilot on the Sea King. From the end of this half horizontal, Bob will push negative 2G to level the aircraft upside down for an inverted pass. This is Bob's second year with Tutor Display. He's operating at base height of 300 feet, except for the two final passes at just 100 feet. The Tutor obviously is the first port of call for most people's experience with aviation in the Royal Air Force, be that Royal Air Force Air Cadets or University Air Squadron students. The next manoeuvre is a ballistic roll, which Bob can use to gain energy for the next part of the sequence. When not displaying, Bob is a qualified flying instructor, or QFI, on 115 Squadron, based at RAF Wittering. He trains fellow frontline pilots into QFIs. During his varied career, Bob has amassed over 8,000 flying hours on 15 different aircraft types. This represents almost a full year in the air. After this half Cuban, Bob will enter the 4-point roll. Get your cameras ready, it's a great photo opportunity. The Tutor has a top speed of 212 miles an hour, or 185 knots, and can achieve maximum positive 6G. Next, we have another wing over, a combined pitching and rolling manoeuvre used to turn the flight path through 180 degrees. You'll notice that every wing over is slightly different, as Bob carefully selects his flight path to cater for differing wind conditions and aircraft energy states. Displaying the Tutor requires careful energy management to its low power-to-weight ratio. Bob now rolls 90 degrees while pointing straight up before completing a stall turn at almost zero airspeed. The two 90-degree turns allow Bob to continue in the same direction. The Tutor is operated by No. 6 Flying Training School in partnership with Babcock International, primarily flying University Air Squadron students and RAF Air Cadets. There are 13 air experience flights across the UK that offer flights to up to 20,000 cadets each year. This could be you if you're between 13 and 20 years old. 50 air cadets a year are now being taught to fly the Tutor up to solo standard. After this conventional stall turn, Bob will enter the slow roll. During the slow roll, you may have noticed the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund heart on the belly of this aircraft, seen since 2022 to celebrate this fantastic charity. The Benevolent Fund supports Royal Air Force personnel, air cadets and veterans wherever they are in need. We are proud to raise awareness for a charity that gives so much to the whole of the RAF family. Visit our tent or view our tutor display leaflets and website to access a QR code to donate to the Benevolent Fund. For those of you that are considering going to university, there are 15 university air squadrons across the UK. On the squadrons, students are taught to fly the tutor by highly experienced military flying instructors, like Bob. It's worth mentioning that the UAS flying syllabus does include solo aerobatics. UASs also provide a huge opportunity for personal development, as well as a wide variety of adventurous training in the UK and expeditions across the globe. I used to be a University Air Squadron student, and it's the best decision I made at uni. We're now in the high energy section of display with a derry turn, quarter clover, and now just finishing the loop, which are quintessential aerobatic manoeuvres. Today, the Royal Air Force is recruiting for multiple rewarding and demanding professions and has an exciting future with the continued development of our combat, utility and maritime patrol aircraft, as well as UK Space Command. They will soon be joined by the introduction of our airborne early warning aircraft, E-7 Wedgetail, and newly remotely piloted capabilities with Protector. The high tempo of operations continues today, with aircraft and personnel deployed around the world, operating with NATO and our other allies. Visit the RAF website to find out more about our professions, including, but not limited to, aircrew, air operations controllers, engineers, medics, cyberspace specialists, and many more. Bob will now enter the final section of display with an oblique loop and a half Cuban. The oblique loop puts the aircraft in plan form twice to the crowd, so it's an excellent photo opportunity. I'd like to take this moment to say a big thank you to our supporters this season. They are the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, Babcock International and Runway 25, who provided much of the merchandise we're giving out at our stand this season. If you've taken any good photos of the tutor, make sure to tag our social medias and use the hashtag #TutorDisplay. Bob will now bring the tutor around for his departing wave at 100 feet. It's our final great photo opportunity. A big thank you to Cosford Air Show for hosting us today. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the 2025 Royal Air Force Tutor Display.
Well, Seb, thank you very much for that great display. Very important aircraft around these here parts, of course, with the only aircraft, RAF aircraft that's actually based here at Cosford. So, yeah, pass our thanks on to everybody involved.
I will do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Squadron leader, Number 29 Squadron at RAF Coningsby on the Eurofighter Typhoon FGR-4.
that 3-point hesitation roll. Look to your left as Nathan repositions for his next manoeuvre. Now this is something very special indeed. It is 5 aileron rolls.
Eurojet EJ200 afterbirning turbofans, 13,500 pounds of thrust without afterburner, 20,000 pounds with afterburner engaged, and it powers this aircraft to a top speed of Mach 2. Outside turn, pushing the aircraft away from you, the blood being forced into Nathan's head, but converting back into positive G, with another what's known as derry turn straight in front of us, rolling one way, turning the other. And 2 more aileron rolls on the outbound 45-degree line. And now we see something of that performance I was talking about as Nathan accelerates the Typhoon in for his high-speed pass. Pretty much as quick as he can go in the air display environment, just under 700 miles an hour. About 9G, positive G, as he breaks away from you there, but he'll now be throttling back the 2 EJ200 engines to idle, bringing that speed down to somewhere in the region of 120 knots. And here, Andy, is where the digital fly-by-wire controls of the Typhoon really come into play.
They do indeed. There's nearly 100 control movements per second this aircraft is performing just to hold this very steady, stable attitude.
The design, like many modern designs, is actually inherently unstable, and the fly-by-wire control system affords artificial stability. And it also provides what's known as carefree handling, meaning the pilot can't take the aircraft outside of its elements. You've got roll control from the small, what are known as flaperons, combination of flap and aileron on the wings, the flaperons, and those 2 canard foreplanes on the forward fuselage give pitch control, and of course the rudder, yaw control. Barrel roll there before Nathan brings the aircraft back onto the main display axis. G once again all the way round this maximum rate turn. disposal there for the final departure of Squadron Leader Nathan Scheuer with the Typhoon FGR-4 of number 29 Squadron. Packard Merlin engined example of the Mustang, the American automobile manufacturer Packard, producing the famous power plant under license. If ever there were an aircraft that's an example of Anglo-American cooperation in military aviation, this aeroplane, the North American Mustang, is it. Because it was produced to meet a British requirement. Famously, a British purchasing commission in New York City was on the search for potential new American-built fighter designs for the Royal Air Force during 1940. One of the companies they visited was North American Aviation in Dallas, Texas. We had the idea that potentially North American, which was still quite a new company at that point, albeit already building the Harvard trainer, one of which we'll see later, in quantity for the RAF, could build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk for the RAF under license. However, North American had other ideas, and it came up with a design it called the NA-73. It progressed, that design, from initial conception to first flight before the end of 1940 wasn't quite as rapid in terms of the number of days involved as has sometimes been stated, but it was nonetheless astonishingly quick, and it produced a highly advanced fighter in aerodynamic terms. The aircraft duly went through flight testing and was earmarked for operational service, and indeed entered service with both the US Army Air Forces and the RAF, known to the Americans as the P-51, in fairly short order, also known as the A-36, as a ground attack and dive bomber platform to the Americans, in which role it was very successful. Was with the Allison V1710 engine, which also equipped most Curtiss P-40s. Very good engine for operations in the low-level role, but it rather ran out of puff at altitude, so this aircraft wasn't initially able to fulfill the potential that was certainly evident in the design as a high-altitude, long-range escort fighter. That was where Britain again really entered the story, because the then commanding officer of a unit based at Duxford called the Air Fighting Development Unit, which evaluated new aircraft and new capabilities for the RAF during wartime, Ian Campbell-Ord, was talking to a friend of his, a man called Ronnie Harker, who was a service liaison test pilot for Rolls-Royce. And between them, the idea was hatched that wouldn't it be a good proposal to engine this, as I say, very streamlined fighter and thereby transform its performance with a Rolls-Royce Merlin. A Mustang was duly converted with a Rolls-Royce built Merlin. It was test flown at the Rolls-Royce factory airfield at Hucknall. Immediately, the transformation was clear. Rolls-Royce couldn't fulfill the sort of demand that was required, though, to produce the Merlins for Mustang production on top of Spitfires, Mosquitoes, Lancasters and the like. So that was where Packard entered the story in the United States, licensed producing the Merlin, and this was where the legend, the Merlin Mustang, was born. The Allison engine Mustangs, however, continued until very late in the war. Particularly the RAF flew them for low-level reconnaissance roles during the D-Day period. But it was the Merlin-powered versions, like the P-51D that we see represented here, that were the great long-range escort fighters for the US 8th Air Force in the European theatre, and indeed for the US Army Air Forces out in the Pacific as well. That was the final pass for this Mustang, which will be coming into land as well. And the markings, I mentioned the fact that this aircraft is named Jersey Jerk. That was the personal moniker applied to a P-51D that was flown by one of the most notable 8th Air Force names of the Second World War, Donald Strait. He was assigned to the 361st Fighter Squadron stationed at Martlesham Heath in Suffolk. Initially equipped with the P-47 like we saw earlier. Strait wanted to name the first P-47 that was allocated to him as Jersey Bounce, but his crew chief had other ideas, his crew chief being named Doc Watson, who was described later by Strait as a real tough kid, a leather worker from Boston. Strait put forward this idea of calling his Thunderbolt Jersey Bounce. Watson replied, "We can't do that. There's a guy in one of the other squadrons already named his airplane Jersey Bounce." And Strait didn't have a name on his fighter when he returned for his 5th mission. Watson said that his ground crew had come up with the name Jersey Jerk. Strait later recalled, "I said, Watson, I'm not a jerk." To which Watson replied, "Sir, let me tell you why we want to name it that. Any guy that would take off in a single-engine airplane, cross the North Sea in the wintertime, and take a chance of getting his rear shot off by the Luftwaffe or by anti-aircraft fire has got to be a jerk." The name stuck, and Donald Strait, who had enlisted in his state's National Guard before joining up formally with the US Army Air Forces, and later on served long into the post-war years with the New Jersey Air National Guard, is commemorated by this Australian-built Mustang of fighter aviation engineering.
And if you look away to your left-hand side as the Mustang is making its approach to land, you see that very curved fighter approach to the airfield. Well, if you imagine you're sat in the cockpit of a Mustang looking forward, you have very little forward visibility, especially when the aircraft comes into landing attitude and the nose gets higher and higher. Virtually no forward visibility, kind of like driving with your bonnet up. So many of these fighters make what we call the curved fighter approach, which is staying very tight to the runway, turning very tightly towards it, so you can at least keep sight of the runway for as long as possible, in this case out to the left-hand side of the canopy, and then kicking the aircraft straight at the last minute, looking left and right, hoping to see the edges of the runway, and then all should be well. And also, and if you're down the front of the crowd line, you may well see this in the next few minutes, taxiing was even harder, because you can see from this aircraft now, there is no forward visibility. So these fighters, Spitfires, Hurricanes as well to a certain extent, would very much follow this kind of snaking taxiing pattern, moving left and right, left and right. The idea being that if you keep snaking, you can look forward each turn.
De Havilland Canada Chipmunk T10s, and they make up the vintage pair. might have gone flying in or flown a Chipmunk in the past, you can in fact fly in the leading aircraft of this pair because they offer air experience flights in this very one from its base at Fenland Aerodrome.
And indeed, His Majesty the King learned to fly in a Chipmunk.
Yes, one that still exists and is based at Old Warden in Bedfordshire.
And in addition to the vintage pair, I think we have at least 2 other Chipmunks in the showground. The Portuguese Chipmunk, regular visitor, but also in the centre of the showground where we have our nice arrangement of training aircraft throughout the years. Of course, you couldn't do that without a Chipmunk. You just couldn't.
This aircraft was designed as a replacement for the de Havilland Tiger Moth biplane elementary trainer for both the RAF and the Royal Canadian Air Force, this being a product with Chipmunk of de Havilland's Canadian arm, but it was also to be produced by de Havilland at its plants in Britain, at Hatfield in Hertfordshire, and at Harden, which we were talking about earlier, the birthplace of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flights, Lancaster, as well as there being production in Canada. It was designed by a Polish emigre, one Zivrod Jakimiuk, who was the chief engineer of de Havilland Canada. And Francis St Barb, who was a director of de Havilland here in the UK, is reported to have said to Jakimiuk, "If you can make a good trainer, I will sell it." And didn't he make good that promise? Around 1,280 of these aeroplanes ended up being built, most of them in the UK, but just over 215 of them in Canada, and 66 by OGMA, the Portuguese state aircraft factory. It was important that this aircraft be developed as cost effectively as possible because it first flew in 1946 in Toronto. Most governments at that time that were potential Chipmunk buyers to replace Tiger Moths and the like didn't have much money. We certainly didn't, to buy new trainers. There were lots of surplus trainers still available, left over from wartime. Lots of countries were effectively bankrupt after so many years of global hostilities. But nonetheless, this aircraft, this monoplane, as opposed to a biplane, found a very important market worldwide. And it was such a big advance over the Tiger Moth as well, because it had things like flaps and brakes and a radio and an enclosed cockpit,
especially today.
Well, it looks, much to my pleasure, as if they've actually got quite a lot of altitude.
It does indeed.
And this is really going to be a display as much as anything of excellent energy management. 145 horsepower from one of the great British aero engines, the de Havilland Gypsy Major 8. And you can see them converting that height into energy for their initial manoeuvre. Pulling up into a very close formation loop. It's quite a while actually since I've seen a formation aerobatic Chipmunk display. Solo arrows, yes, but not in formation.
I think the last I remember were the Caledonian Chipmunks, about 10-15 years ago.
Based up
in
at
Scotland.
Perth, yes.
Perth. We had them display at Lucas a few times.
Yes, I've seen the likes of John Romaine and Lee Proudfoot perform formation arrows in Chipmunks at Duxford, but this, as I say, a new departure for the vintage pair this year. An initial 3 loops. And turning tightly as they come up to the right-hand end of the display line, and of course maintaining close formation, Andy, in low-powered aircraft like this, very challenging.
You can't just open the throttle and suddenly accelerate, or hit the brakes and suddenly slow down. You've got to, in aviation we often talk about being ahead of the jet. We've certainly got to be ahead of the Gypsy here. If you think about what you need to do now, it's far, far too late.
beautiful line astern barrel roll there, so named because they're basically describing the inside outline of an imaginary barrel positioned on its side in the sky. The first Chipmunks were delivered to the RAF 75 years ago this year to the Oxford University Air Squadron at Kidlington. This type is still on RAF charge because the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight at RAF Coningsby has 2 of these aircraft for tail dragger conversion and refresher purposes. In fact, there are Chipmunks on the strength of all 3 of the historic flights, the military historic flights in Britain, though those 2 now the only ones still on the military register because the Royal Navy Historic Flight is no more. Navy Wings Heritage Flight, they're represented here. They still have a Chipmunk, and we've got the historic Army Aircraft Flight Chipmunk, what used to be the Army Air Corps Historic Aircraft Flight when it was in military hands, here in the static display.
And even in its primary role, certainly with university air squadrons and air experience flights, stayed in service to the end of the 1990s. I mean, that's an incredible record.
Yeah, 1996 was when the final ones were retired by the AEFs, at that stage in favour of the Scottish Aviation Bulldog, which had also replaced them with the university air squadrons. And then, of course, now we have the Grom Tutor in this role. And they were still in service with the Army Air Corps until 1997 with their basic fixed-wing flight at Middle Wallop. But we mustn't forget the other roles Chipmunks played in RAF service. One of the most famous was clandestine photographic reconnaissance with the RAF Gatow station flight in what was then West Berlin. The Allies had the right to fly around the Berlin control zone, and they used the opportunity for reconnaissance with various helicopters, but also light aeroplanes like a fleet of Chipmunks. And one of the last Gatow station flight Chipmunks is one of the 2 with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight today. In towards us for a lovely crossing break. Nice to see 2 colour schemes represented here, Andy. The earlier silver with the yellow training bands, and the later red and white.
Indeed. The red and whites for me is the sort of real characteristic colour scheme for this aircraft.
Yes, it's the one I grew up seeing Chipmunks in, flying from RAF Coltishall in Norfolk, flying air cadets during the summer.
I think we used to call it Support Command colours.
Support Command, absolutely. The Chipmunk was always a super display aeroplane as they come in for a crossover. The de Havilland test pilot Pat Fillingham used to put on fantastic aerobatic displays of Chipmunks at Farnborough back in the 1950s, and there were later several display teams of them in the British military, the Blue Chips and the Skylarks in the RAF, and later my favourite was the Grey Owls of the Army Air Corps, so named because of the age of the pilots, who included some incredibly distinguished test pilots carrying on flying but performing basic flying grading for the Army.
As was, of course, done on the air experience flights, of which this aircraft was a stalwart, obviously, where so many retired air officers would see out their careers instructing, taking cadets for their first experience. You sit next to Flying Officer Smith and you realise, no, it's Air Vice Marshal.
Yeah. I mentioned how it's still used by the BBMF, the Chipmunk. Also, and represented by the one leading this pair here, still used by all sorts of civilian operations for much the same purpose as it has ever been used, providing elementary tailwheel training. And we've said this often about a few aircraft in today's show, but have you ever heard anyone say much of a bad word about the Chipmunk's handling?
Absolutely not, absolutely not. Certainly one of those aircraft that just had enough about it to not let you get lured into a false sense of security, which is just what you want in a training aircraft.
Another very fine break right on the display datum. Yeah, that's the key thing, and that's something we'll come on to with the Harvard later. That is a terrible old cliche, I know, but easy to fly, difficult to fly well and accurately, but it is true.
Very true.
One of the Shuttleworth collection pilots, Richard Crockett, wrote that flying a Chipmunk is quite simply one of the most fantastic aviation experiences you can have. And quite a lot of people have compared it to being a mini Spitfire, almost, in some respects. One of the things I'm finding really impressive about this display, quite a lot of brakes, immediate and very snappy rejoins.
It's not just very well flown, it's been very well put together. There's a lot of thought gone into this.
Yeah. The red and white aircraft in this pair was built at the de Havilland plant at Harden in Chester, served with all sorts of units until its retirement in the second half of the 1990s. And there's a really good illustration in this aircraft of the sort of progression a pilot can undertake on an aeroplane such as this, because when it was retired from the RAF, it was bought by the Higgins family, and John Higgins, the number 2 in this team, who we've seen display at Cosford individually and in this pair several times, was at one stage the youngest holder in the UK of a display authorization from the Civil Aviation Authority. He was aged just 20 when he got his first DA. He's now got several hundred hours on Chipmunks and must be one of the most seasoned Chipmunk display pilots in the country. And you'll see they're staying in close formation now as their sequence comes to an end. And I expect we're going to see a very nice close formation landing. And if it's anything like the landings I've seen them do as a pair at other events, it could well be a rather nice side-slipped formation landing.
It's certainly a very tight approach. I mentioned the Mustang making a curved fighter approach. There's good reason for that aircraft with the lack of forward view. I think the Chipmunk is the vintage pair are doing it because they can.
Well, I thought that was an absolutely splendid display by the vintage pair. David Petters in the lead, John Higgins, the number 2, with their pair of de Havilland Canada Chipmunk T10s. Utter nostalgia, but a wonderful display in the present day. something we won't see very often at air shows this year. The F-35B Lightning heading back to its home at RAF Mara main operating base for the UK's Lightning Force. And there it is for this very rare appearance out to our left, the NATO multinational multi-role tanker unit, Airbus A330.
Fabulous first for Cosford. Now you can see the probe has been extended. Here in the UK we tend to favour a different way. We use the probe, the drone, as opposed to the flying boom that you see here. This aircraft capable of using both methods to refuel. positioning now for its last manoeuvre from the Royal Netherlands Air Force historic flight, the Spitfire.
An incredible survivor, not just because of all of those combat operations it undertook towards the end of World War II, but also from what happened after it, because it was used as an airfield decoy for a time at Eindhoven, and then number 14 Squadron of the RAF, quote, liberated it. If you heard Juice's interview with Jonathan that we put out before the show, other terms are available for what happened to the aircraft, but they liberated it and took it to their base at Oldenburg and then to Gütersloh, and it ended up coming back in an RAF short Belfast to Bryce Norton in 1969. All sorts of moves in the UK. The Battle of Britain Memorial Flight used that airframe for spares usage for a time, but then in 1984 it went back to the Netherlands, and Pete Kinsey, the famous British warbird pilot, flew it again in 1993, and
Well, hi everybody, that is it for part one of the, well, I'm going to say, Cosford Air Show footage. We'll get some videos put together. There's the Red Arrows to come, and there's the, oh crikey, was it, I think it was a Spanish F-16 with the conformal tanks, yeah? So that'll be on the next video. We'll be leaving the chat comments open. Hopefully you can hear me rattling on here. And so I'll join you in the chat in a couple of seconds.